So, welcome to tonight's Active Travel Cafe, and as usual, we will start with our around the attendees with any news that you would like to share, which we'll aim to finish by about 5:15. And I'm delighted that we're joined tonight by our guest speakers. Phil Jones from Phil Jones Associates, consultant who's worked on all sorts of active travel and indeed transport projects, but is here tonight to talk about the introduction of 20 miles an hour default speed limit in Wales with colleague Kaarina Ruta from who worked on that project in Wales as well. And we will also hear before the end from Mark Philpott, who's actually going to talk about how highways in the public realm can be designed in order to make the most of that 20 mile an hour speed limits where they exist. So that's what we've got in store for us tonight. And without further ado, I think I will welcome anyone to share any news that they have got from where they are. Any hands up? Oh, perhaps we're going to be thin on the news this week. Might be my view, but I'm not seeing any hands up. So here we go. Should we start with Tim in Leicester?
Good evening, everybody. Bit of good news and a bit of bad news. There's a Labour Walks and Cycles conference next Saturday, the 1st of Feb. Members welcome. It's happening in Leicester, and lots of people on this call are speaking at it, which will be good, or attending. The bad news is that we've just moved £3.5 million out of capital and into propping up the council. Like many authorities, I think probably hanging on for the taps to be turned back on last July are having to deal with reality. And yeah, a bit of bad news there, I'm afraid, from Leicester.
Thanks, Tim. Let's go to Matthew in Durham.
Hi, we had a very good, useful meeting with our new Senior Active Travel Officer in the Durham County Council last week. One of the things we were bringing up was how to do things better than they did them a year or so ago when they rebuilt a major junction near our university, which is supposedly on several routes identified in the LC whip, but no cycle infrastructure went in. So I was wondering if anyone knows of good examples of councils where they actually look at LTN 120 junction assessments in their safety audits, or if they manage to get this kind of scheme going to highways committees. Could you pop examples in the chat? That would be very helpful to me, because I think it would be good to highlight with our local council other authorities that are doing this better. As it was, it didn't go to our highways committee because apparently if they don't need a TRO, it can be entirely delegated to officers. So this one wasn't consulted on very well. But we've established a good initial meeting with the new officer, and that was very encouraging, and we're looking forward to working with him more. But examples would be great in the chat if you can.
Thanks, Matthew. I might be wrong, but that's the first time I've been on when we have had an update from Durham. So we do like it when we get updates from all around the country, especially the north where I'm based. And also we like it when people, ask for sharing of insights and info, because that's something that Active Travel Cafe is really good for. It's always someone who knows the answer or has stuff to share. Mark, over to you.
Yeah, well, it's slightly tangential, but it's a plea for advice and information from places with park and ride sites, because the ruling Labour group in Brighton have had it in their mind for some decades that park and ride is the solution to all the traffic problems of Brighton Hove. They're proposing it again at Cabinet on Thursday, but they're proposing some very light touch, as in calling out to businesses and saying, hey, have you got a car park we can use? And we might be able to run buses from it. So it would be really good to know from places like Oxford and York and etc. that have got park and ride, whether what the pros and cons and the reality of what they're like, because of course the consultants that they've employed say they're fantastic everywhere and it'll be wonderful. And I know it's grayer than that. So just a plea for some background information from everyone.
And Mark, presumably, do you think Park and Ride has a place? It's just not.
I'm agnostic on Park and Ride. I think Park and Ride can
Okay.
work. I think there are problems. Andrew Potter, who's like the guru of Park and Ride, spoke at TPM. You know, it depends on do you charge for the parking, do you charge for the bus? If you charge for the parking and make the bus free, then people will walk there and use the bus, and then they won't use paid for buses. You know, there are pros and cons. 360-degree cities like Oxford and York have roads coming in all over the place, and they can stop it. 180-degree cities like Brighton can't always get, and also with national parks, can't always get the car parks. So there is a lot of issues. They're not an answer. They could be, but one of the other issues is when you put Park and Ride parking in, you know, the advice is take out the equivalent number of parking spaces in the city centre. Otherwise, all you're doing is building more car parks. So
I'm glad I asked. I feel like that's a future talk coming on in the future.
but I'm not the Park and Ride expert. That's
you've done
my
a
point.
Done a good little taster there. Thanks, Mark. Adam.
Just first on Mark, Baines did a study on link and ride effectiveness on the east side of Bath. So I'll send that through to you. So I think it's ACOM did it. It was really detailed, and they actually found one of the most effective things to do was to basically normalize pricing on all existing bus routes. You know, so that they price cap. So if a Park and Ride is £3.50 return, then the route out there was £3.50 return. It still had the same effect because people knew that they wouldn't be charged anymore and could come in via bus. But anyway, what I wanted to, I was hopefully the last person to talk, which is I wanted to talk about, you know, the Active Travel Cafe, our donation drive, which we're doing at the moment, is sitting at 82%, so it's £600. I'll put a link in the here, but I just wanted to say to everybody, thank you so much. You make it, you make this happen. You help us kind of get this there. And really appreciate the contributions that we've had, and it's good to know that we're pretty much there for the year, and yeah, and we're financed, so that's brilliant.
Thank you, Adam, and thanks for people who are adding lots of info about Park and Ride in the chat. If anyone has the link to the Labour conference, if they wouldn't mind putting that in there, I haven't seen that posted, so that would be useful. Mark, sorry, did you want to come back?
Well, no, it's not. It's just an appeal again. So I'm on the papers panel for Transport Practitioners meeting, and I think the closing date is this week. And it's a great conference. It's very much a peer-to-peer conference, and it's where I heard about Park and Ride stuff a lot. So if anyone wants to put a paper in, it doesn't have to be. You don't have to be professional. I'm on the judging panel, but I don't get to see names. They're all blind, so I won't know that it's one of you that's put it in. But if one of you wants to put a paper in, I'll put the link for papers in the chat, and it would be great to get people's lived experience and what they're working on or doing things in those papers. They're half an hour slots, so usually 10 minutes, 15 minutes talking and 15 minutes questions. It's in Manchester as well.
Thank you, Mark. Well, I'm in Manchester. I might have to have a look at that. And that reminded me that the sort of main active travel conference of the year, Active City, Cycle City, which is in York this year, is actually, I think their closing date for pitches to present is the end of the month. So, right, I think unless anyone's got anything else to share, then I think we'll go to our speakers. So, as I said at the beginning, delighted to be welcomed this week with Phil Jones, eminent transport expert from Phil Jones Associates. You've got to be important if your company is named after you, right? And his colleague, Kaarina Ruta. And Phil is actually joining us from Sheffield Station, which I think is really going beyond what's required of people presenting to Active Travel Cafe, presenting from a public transport station. So, Phil, I've probably cursed it now, but Phil, are you able to join? Over to you guys.
I am. Apologies if you get the station announcements in the background. How does that sound? Is it okay?
It is, yeah.
Yeah, great. And just to say, Kaarina is well. Kaarina, do you want to introduce yourself? Because not a colleague, although we've worked closely together.
Yeah, I'll do that. So I'm Kaarina Ruta, and I work for the Welsh Local Government Association. And effectively, at the time that I've been working there for 3.5 years now, I have been mainly working on the introduction of 20 mile an hour. I've also been working on other road safety and active travel matters, but the main project really has been the introduction of 20 mile an hour.
Yeah, so we've been partners in crime, as it were, in some people's eyes. Kaarina, could you
Yeah, I'll share the
get
slides now.
thank
Let's
you,
see.
thank you. So yeah, just to say, so I'm no longer involved in the project. I was brought into this by Lee Waters. Many of you will know Lee. Still is a member of Senedd, a member of the Welsh Parliament, but for several years was transport and climate change minister, and prior to becoming a politician, he was director of Sustrans Cardiff. So, yeah, Kareem, if you just move on to the next slide. So, yeah, my involvement started. I was invited by Lee to chair the task force, which is what that means, Group TASGLI. So the Welsh 20 miles an hour task force. This started as a project from Mark Drakeford, who was then the First Minister, who made a commitment to 20 miles an hour as a default speed limit for residential areas. And I'll come to the definition of that later, but that was his commitment in his personal manifesto when he stood to be Labour leader in the Senedd. So a task force was set up in July 2019. So I was invited to chair it, and it was it was a really interesting year that we did that, and I was very clear from the off that the purpose of the task force was not to advise Welsh Government whether to do a default 20 miles an hour. I was able to take that as read from the manifesto and the policy of the government. The purpose of the task force was to advise how to do it. So we had a broad range of stakeholders. We had lots of working groups and lots of deliberations. Really interesting. Obviously, we finished the report. It drifted into COVID, so we started pre-COVID, and then COVID happened as we were finishing the report. Published the report in July 2020. And it was recommendations. All recommendations were accepted with cross-party support at that time. And the only party that voted against it was UKIP. The Conservatives supported it. And in fact, when the task force was set up, there was criticism from the Conservatives about Labour should be doing this more quickly. So that which changed as time went on. So yeah, if you move on, Kaarina. So the task force, the report came out. I was then really pleased to be asked to continue working with the Welsh Government to be an external chair of the steering group. So just bring that sort of external scrutiny, support, whatever to the process. And it was absolutely fascinating working closely with people from Welsh Government and Welsh Local Government Association. Actually, I should have said the task force was a joint Welsh Government, Welsh Local Government Association project in the first place. So it was a very simple piece of legislation. It was really just changing one line in the Road Traffic Regulation Act that says roads with street lighting, which are restricted roads in law, the law has been since I think 1936 that's 30 miles per hour. The law, the Welsh law just says for 30 miles an hour, read 20 miles an hour, which I think is quite an interesting way of doing it. So it just did that at a stroke. It passed in July, but then there was over a year given to local authorities to do all the preparatory work for it to come into force. But a couple of details: 20 mile an hour zones were removed, so there are no such things as 20 mile an hour zones in Wales anymore. On the basis that the idea of a kind of special zone where it's 20 makes no sense when almost everywhere in urban areas is 20. So that was removed. If you click on Kaarina, and another little change was no need and no cost in providing repeaters. So because 20 is the default, so street lighting means 20 in Wales, no need and no cost for any repeaters. And actually, over time, the existing 20 repeaters will go, and where the roads are 30, then there will be 30 repeaters. So Wales is now different to the rest of the UK on that. So if we move on. Obviously, though, it's the default, and there was an awful lot of quite heated debate in the Senedd about the use of the word blanket. I think the Conservative leader, because the Conservatives by this time had come out very firmly against all of this nonsense, and Andrew R.T. Davies was repeatedly admonished for using the term blanket, because it's not a blanket. There's nothing. All it is a default, a national default. There's no fettering of the ability of local authorities to set whatever speed limit they choose for roads with street lighting. But clearly, local authorities needed something on which to base it. So we produced a document in November 22 called Setting Exceptions to the 20 miles an hour default speed limit. But we relied very heavily on, if you've not seen it, there's a very useful result of a UN conference from 2021, I think, Article 11, which talks about a maximum road travel speed of 30 kilometres where vulnerable road users and vehicles mix in a frequent and planned manner, except where strong evidence exists that higher speeds are safe. So if for example, if there is good cycle segregation, if there's good pedestrian crossings, if there are footways, then there is no mixing to speak of going on, then higher speeds are appropriate. But where cyclists and pedestrians may be crisscrossing in a town centre, then the speed limit there should not be an exception there. So that was how that guidance was written. So if we move on. And so 17th of September 2023 was this big sea change, and this was the distribution of speed limits. So the green bars show the national default, and the 20/40/50 show where local authorities have set exceptions. So you can see the national default for lit and unlit roads, the vast majority of urban roads with 30 and rural roads are 60. And then if we flip on, that changed. Well, overnight. It was midnight on the 17th of September. And so now 37% of the road network in Wales flipped to 20. Now, I think it's fair to say that that exceptions process, there were different approaches to the quantity of exceptions in different parts of Wales. Some and I think with hindsight, and Kaarina will come on to this, maybe the exceptions guidance was perhaps a little stringent if it was applied to the letter, and those authorities that did apply it to the letter, there was very few exceptions made. Some authorities, particularly in South Wales, took a more liberal approach and did exempt some more of the main roads leading into cities like Swansea, and that became, and so obviously this was hugely, I'm sure you'll remember, it was hugely controversial. There was a very big backlash, and I think we would have had that anyway. And I think with hindsight, the comms that Welsh Government did, even though we've been trying to push, I've been trying to push that for some time, wasn't as comprehensive as it should have been. Nevertheless, I think some of the pushback was greater because of this discrepancy between North and South Wales. So. But yes, if we can move on. Yeah, so this is what we've got. So this map is from Insight Warehouse, so Agilicis road safety consultancy produced national maps showing what speed limits are. Pink is 20, and you can just see now the preponderance of 20 miles an hour in Wales. But you can also see, actually, there's some English cities. London is really, I think more than 50% of the roads in London are now 20 miles an hour. You can see Nottingham is kind of sticking out there on Bristol. Birmingham and the West Midlands a bit more patchy. Manchester, Liverpool doing pretty well as well. But you can see Wales, it was this transformational change that happened very, very quickly. Okay. Yeah. Flip on, Kaarina?
Yeah. Yeah, I
Thank
have.
You. Oh, thank you. Yeah, sorry.
Yeah, sorry.
It's probably my internet. Agilicis produced very, very quickly. It was all credit to them for the season initiative. They very quickly, a week after the change, they produced some data. These are median speeds, so they might seem quite low. I think it's important. This is average speed, but I think they're actually median speeds. They are perhaps slower than you might expect from a free flow situation because it includes lots of road sections. These are thousands of road sections, including approaching junctions. But nevertheless, nearly a 3 miles an hour reduction in speed was considered to be pretty much in line with what we expected and pretty satisfactory. There is research that shows for every 1 miles per hour reduction in average speed, there's about a 6% reduction in collisions. So this was expecting to lead to about 18-20% reduction. Actually became better than that. But unfortunately, since then, things have crept up a little bit, which is a slight worry. And I think now it's a matter of bedding it in, building on the enforcement, and perhaps retrofitting with some traffic calming. I should have said there was no traffic calming at all. Welsh Government specifically said to local authorities, we will not fund any traffic calming. We can't afford to do that across the whole of Wales. We'll simply change the speed limit, see what happens, and then perhaps come back with further works later. So, but if we move on, but this is so as we are today, we've got 9 months of complete data. So obviously started on 17th September, but working in quarters, we've got from the 1st of October 2023 to the 30th of June 2024 has been published so far. It'll be any day now, or certainly in the next week or so, we should get the final quarter. So we'll have a complete year's worth of data. But I can't do the maths in my head now, but it was about 489. Does that sound right? 489 reductions in casualties in 9 months, which is pretty remarkable, I think. That's getting on for two a day. I'll come on to the questions in a sec, but obviously that's all severities, but 10 fewer people in those 9 months have been fatally injured. So I think really there's no arguing in my mind that this has not been effective, highly effective. It's something like a 26% reduction in overall casualties, so very, very successful. So, okay. And the final slide for me, and just to say, this is also having benefits to people who do drive cars, and not surprisingly, if it's leading to fewer crashes and less damage, then in a competitive market, insurance companies are finding that they can reduce their premiums, and so that is happening. It was announced some months ago in Wales, and now it's becoming more widespread that if you live in a 20-mile-an-hour area, it will actually reduce your car insurance. So I think that's it from me, I think, isn't it, Kaarina?
Yep, I think so. So I'll take over from here. Thank you, Phil. So as Phil already explained, obviously, the local authorities had been given exceptions guidance to help them decide which roads could remain at 30 mile an hour, but it had always been clear that there were going to be differences as to how the local authorities, how the highway authorities were going to apply that, and that probably some adjustments had to be made at a later stage. But obviously, we had a new minister responsible for transport. Ken Skates was appointed last year in March, and he announced a 3-phase 20-mile-an-hour plan when he came in. So he wanted to embark on a listening exercise, both nationally and locally. So nationally, he spoke to a lot of groups and people and wanted to hear what people thought about 20 mile an hour and whether it had been applied, whether it was on the right roads. And also, he wanted to continue with a partnership working with the local authorities and to see whether the guidance would need to be refined. And then we're now getting into the phase of actual potential changes that are going to be made, but I'll come back to that later. But really, the key challenges were, and Phil already said, I mean, there was obviously a huge kind of backlash and the biggest ever petition to the Senedd that was signed and debated. But really, it was about balancing that road safety with the network efficiency and also managing public expectations on changes that were going to come. So it was all a little bit chaotic for a while. So just to go back to the exceptions guidance. So really, as I said, it had always been clear that because of the differences in the settlements and the different types of places, but also down to the resource that the local authorities had to look at applying the exceptions guidance before the national legislation came into force, we ended up with a situation where there were quite stark differences between local authorities as to how many roads they had accepted. So Still, when Lee Waters was still the Deputy Minister, he set up a group, an expert panel that both Phil and I were on, to look at how the exceptions guidance had been applied and whether there were any lessons to be learned and whether the exceptions guidance should be changed. So we worked on that, and we published a final report in May 2024. By that time, as I said, we had then a new First Minister and a new Minister responsible for transport. So in that final report, we made recommendations as to what we thought could be changed maybe in guidance, so that we would get to a position where local authorities would come a little bit closer to the middle. So those who had very few exceptions would maybe have some more. So obviously then, so a new guidance was then indeed published, and it was worked on together in partnership with the local authorities, and new guidance was published last July. But really, the main principle, the mixing principle that Phil talked about, was retained, and it kind of stayed as a gatekeeper there, so that not too many changes could be could happen, really, because the idea that where there were a certain density of housing and shops or schools, doctors and so on, so where you would expect people to be in town centres, village centres, those were the places where 20 mile an hour was and is the right speed limit. But what the new guidance maybe made more clear was that there were also other considerations in addition to the place considerations, the place criteria. So looking a little bit more at the movement criteria, especially if they were important strategic roads, if they were important bus routes, and also looking at the road characteristics themselves. So looking at if there were roads that were actually outside maybe of city or town or village centres, where yes, there might be some housing, but maybe some housing only on one side, and or pedestrians and cyclists are catered for by safe infrastructure, crossings and so on. Those could be roads where potentially, you know, a higher speed limit of 30 mile an hour could be proposed. So really where we are now, so new guidance published, as I said, new criteria were added or just made more clear really where there's movement and road characteristics. And this is now a framework to support all the highway authorities to make decisions if they so wish. So all the local authorities, in addition to the national listening programme that I talked about, that our Transport Minister embarked on, the local authorities were also invited to hear from their communities, hear from the people, and to write to their local authorities if they thought that on certain roads the speed limit should be changed. So in these last few months, the local authorities have been going through these requests, and they have been reassessing certain roads as to the suitability to propose a 30 mile an hour limit. And there's two authorities in North Wales that have started and they have actually made proposed TROs to change some of their roads back to 30. But overall and across Wales, it does look like it will not be very high numbers. So obviously in the media at some point it was portrayed as, you know, everything's going back to 30. That certainly isn't the case. It is very much about minor adjustments. In some authorities, it will be a little bit more as expected because they made very few exceptions to start with. In others, it will really only be maybe a handful of roads. And of course, it will have to go through a normal traffic regulation order process, like with any other local speed limits. So it is very much now a local matter as compared to is no longer so much a national, that national change really has happened. I just wanted to briefly touch on monitoring, and I won't go into too much detail, but Transport for Wales is undertaking monitoring on behalf of Welsh Government, and they are looking, in addition to obviously speeds, they're looking at quite a lot of other key performance kind of indicators. But really the main objective of this policy was to improve the well-being of people in Wales. And we have here in Wales, of course, the well-being of future generations legislation. So all these indicators and have been built around that. But the main objectives are obviously to reduce injury and death, encourage a change in travel behaviour, and reduce the negative effects of vehicle use on the wider environment. So they are publishing reports over for the next kind of 5 years. They're going to be monitoring these. And in addition to that, there's also an evaluation framework that the Welsh Government is going to commission to look also at the kind of value for money, so evaluating this policy that will be done externally to the Welsh Government. So there will be a final kind of evaluation report expected in 2029. And that should also hopefully include some things like, so obviously in addition to all the speed monitoring and that kind of monitoring, but also looking at attitudes of people and how that has changed over time as well. So last slide. So what next? Obviously, Phil, you already touched upon this a little bit. So there will obviously need to be continued engagement and enforcement. And I agree with you, also continued communication really about the wider benefits of the policy, especially. So the road safety benefits are starting to kind of come through, and with obviously the collision data we're getting. But I think it's also about the wider benefits that, you know, these slower speeds in communities can bring. But clearly, obviously, there will also need to be probably some more targeted physical speed management measures in certain places where you know, compliance isn't so good, and where maybe the road layout really lends itself to higher speeds. So maybe there can be some adjustments made there. Although obviously, Phil, as you said, Welsh Government always brought this in not with the idea of having speed humps everywhere. That's not going to be the case, but there will certainly be some small targeted changes. I already said about the monitoring and evaluation will continue for the next 5 years. And we are now also working towards a road safety strategy here in Wales, although it will maybe not be called a strategy because we can't call it that, but it will still be that. So we're working towards making obviously safe speeds as part of a safe system and embedding it all into this wider context of road safety. So yes, that's all from us too. And I'll end the slideshow so that you can all ask us questions. Stop sharing. There we go.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. It's fantastic to get, you know, a sort of chronological lay down of how we've got to this, and some great data and insights in there. Lots of questions in the Q&A, but I would encourage people who've posted in the chat question-ish types to put them in the Q&A, because we're only going to take them from the Q&A. I'll start with this one, which is a sort of opening general point, which is what was it, if it might not have been one thing, but what was it that persuaded the Welsh Government to actually go for this change? We had Lee Waters on actually a while back talking about the Future Generations Act and how that helped kind of create the sort of policy framework for change. But yeah, what was the thing? Was it casualties, costs, you know? Yeah, what do you think, Phil or Kaarina?
I mean, maybe I'll just talk. I think it was largely casualties, but I think it was always recognised that there are wider benefits of 20 miles per hour. I mean, it's something actually we spent a lot of time debating when we were thinking about the common strategy about what to emphasise. But I think the headline message on casualties seems to be the one that drives home. Would you say that, Kaarina?
Yeah, definitely. And that was obviously then chosen as well as the kind of main objective of the policy in the communication, because that was also because it was felt, I think, that people would, you know, most people would relate to that and understand that and accept that more easily, I think, than maybe the other less tangible, wider benefits. But still, I also think that with the, you know, having the Future Generations legislation there is very much a mandate as well to look at those wider benefits. And then I think it was just a kind of coming together of you know, people at the right time, and you know, that made it happen as well. So no doubt, you know, the Mark Drakeford having it in his personal political manifesto, and then, but obviously initially there was very much you know, cross-party political support for it as well. So it was seen as, you know, why shouldn't we do this if it saves lives? You know, why would you not agree with this?
And I think actually
Thank
I should
you.
pay tribute.
Yeah.
I should just pay tribute to Rod King, who I see is on the call, and just because it was, I mean, Rod was involved, I think, before either of us were, and with campaigners from Wales, actually took the idea, my understanding, to politicians and said, you know, since it was the passing of the 2017 Wales Act that gave Welsh Government the power, the Senedd, the power to change the default speed limit. So it was something that was initially taken by campaigners to politicians. So I think, you know, we should pay tribute to the power of campaigners to make that change, actually.
Yeah, thanks, and welcome to Rod. Rod, I may come to you with a question later, so we need to acknowledge your presence in the room. But for now, I'm going to go down the list of the Q&A with the most kind of upvoted ones. So this is a question from Susie in Wandsworth. How supportive were the police, and has their attitude changed over time?
I find say, because when I recall the very first meeting of the task force, there were a couple of people from the police who were the only ones, I think, leaning back with their arms folded, and so the body language kind of said that at that time those two individuals weren't particularly supportive. But over time, I think it did change. We had I've forgotten his surname now. Kaarina
Jason Williams.
Jason Williams was effectively delegated to be part of the 20-mile-an-hour project team, and he was fantastic. And I think that did change, and there is now, I mean, enforcement is still continuing, Kaarina, yeah?
Yes, yeah. So I would say, Phil, as you said, I think initially, surely, I think that you know, I think the attitude has changed very much. But now, you know, enforcing 20 mile an hour is as they would be enforcing any other speed limits. So we obviously have the safety partnership here in Wales as well, Go Safe, and it's become very much part of, you know, their daily business, really. So I think it is an important step to show that we all know, and, you know, disagree probably on, you know, whether there should be more or less enforcement. There's a lot of people who think there's still obviously not enough enforcement, but it wasn't any different when it was 30 miles an hour. So very much so, it has become, you know, the reality in Wales, and the police are enforcing 20 mile an hour limits as they would have been enforcing 30 mile an hour limits and other limits now.
Thank you.
And there's a really interesting, sorry, I'll just say there's a really interesting innovative tool that has been used by the Fire and Rescue Service of doing roadside immediate driver education. So when drivers are stopped, they're given the opportunity to do a 20-minute road safety awareness course there at the roadside, and then go on their way. And that's proven to be very successful.
Yeah, so they're working together with the police, because of course it's only the police that can stop cars when travelling over the speed limit, and they are asked there and then whether they prefer to listen to a presentation than to get, you know, points and a fine. So that has been received very well, and they're continuing to do that at least until the end of March.
Thank you. Right, we've got loads of questions to get through, so I'm going to take them in twos, and, you know, maybe if one does one and one does the other.
Yeah, you go. Yeah.
Right. Okay. 20 miles an hour has been seen to be part of the backlash against Welsh Labour and the growth of reform. How do you think that backlash should be managed so things like 20 miles an hour are more popular? And second question, which might be more one for Phil, I don't know if you feel that one, you can answer that one, Kaarina, but the other one might be more for Kaarina, which is, are there cost savings for authorities to dropping to 20 miles an hour? And that was something that actually struck me in your presentation, that there might well be. So, you know, the repeaters that you don't have to put up, etc. And I noticed you said about kind of quantifying the disbenefits of 30 miles an hour. So yeah, question about political managing backlash, and question about cost.
I mean, I think we always knew that it was going to be there. The advice from the task force was that there should be the so-called listening. I mean, Kaarina mentioned the listening exercise that's been done post implementation. The advice was to do a really comprehensive listening exercise pre-implementation. The feeling was, or the view was from advisors, that if we put the question to the public would support 20, and then we could say, and we are now, the government is implementing it in accordance with the public's will. Unfortunately, that didn't happen, and so the comms that happened was to tell people what was going to happen rather than ask permission for it to happen. And I think that is maybe a lesson to be learned for other kinds of intervention, really. To ask to get that consent before you move forward.
Okay, so I'll come back on the cost saving. So obviously, in this case, I mean, the local authorities didn't have the choice. The national legislation changed the default speed limit, but obviously there were, there was clearly a cost saving in doing it this way, rather than there had been, there were some 20-mile-an-hour zones and limits in Wales before this, but very few. And it would have cost obviously much more doing it kind of bit by bit and having to have the repeaters. Whereas with this approach, all the restricted roads changed to 20, unless the local authorities decided otherwise. And only on those few 30-mile-an-hour roads did the local authorities have to use repeaters now. But obviously, this has been funded by Welsh Government, this change, and also the changes that are happening now will be funded by Welsh Government directly.
Thank you. Right, two more that are linked. One is, has there been any engagement interest from Welsh councils bordering Wales? I've seen some increased calls for 20 mile an hour in Shropshire. I thought that was a really interesting question. And related, if I just scroll down, oh, where's it gone? People are sending in questions faster than I can keep up. Well, if one of you could take that one while I find the second one.
Maybe I'll just take that because we have been doing quite a lot of work in Shrewsbury, Shropshire's unitary authority, and we have seen increased interest there. So yeah, I think hopefully yes. I mean, I think it's hard to disentangle because I think there is rising interest in 20 across England. So which so others would comment on. So yeah.
Yeah, I think that's the other question. Do you see this being rolled out not only across the UK but beyond?
Well, I think there's certainly a move. I mean, if you look at other European countries, there's a lot of, cities, especially obviously at the moment, that have, introduced 30 kilometers an hour limits, like Paris, Brussels, Bologna recently published data on, on their first year. And of course, Spain introduced before Wales a very similar, 30 kilometers an hour on all kind of single. The legislation works slightly differently, but effectively it's more or less the same. So I think it definitely, has sparked more interest, and people will see the results and will be interested in it.
Yeah, the Republic of Ireland as well, aren't they? The Republic of Ireland is changing the default within defined urban areas to 30 kilometres as well. So that's happening.
Great. So that's hopefully a sort of wider impact. These three questions are all kind of about impact and monitoring, I suppose. Have you seen? So I'll give them all together, but I can remind you of them. Don't expect you to memorize. Have you seen any impact of levels on walking and cycling yet? Is there any evidence of a reduction in nitrogen oxide? I think that's what NOx stands for, PM10s and other pollutants in urban settings? And have there been any measurements made of noise reductions?
Gosh, Kaarina,
please. Yeah. So walking and cycling, not yet, too early to say. So that will be part of the monitoring and evaluation framework. There's also a kind of wider national travel transport survey that is being set up in Wales, because we don't have very good data, but that will hopefully, over the next few years, we will, but too early to say. Reduction in nitrogen oxide, quite complicated. So it has been monitored as part of, one of the indicators, but the difficulty really is to show the change from 30 to 20 and to find the right location. So what they have found, and it's sort of very localized, what they have found so far is that there has effectively been no change, but that's also because it's very difficult to demonstrate that it would be down to the simple, the change, because there's so many other factors around that will. So really, I've always been saying, the air quality improvements that will come from this, hopefully over time, will be linked with the fact that people will feel more safe to walk and cycle for short distances, and therefore there are less cars on the road. I think it's very difficult to demonstrate the difference between a car travelling at 20 and 30 and to demonstrate, what that does to air quality and air pollution. And then the final one, no, we're not monitoring noise, but there's a really interesting study from Brussels. So we were pointing at the benefits of, reduced noise, because there is quite clear evidence from other places. So I'm mentioning Brussels especially because they did quite a detailed study when they introduced their 30 kilometers an hour on speed, on noise reduction.
Brilliant. That was 3 questions rattled through there. I've still got loads more. So I'm going to keep going because this is brilliant stuff. Question about, so I guess 20 mile an hour, I kind of think residential roads, it makes sense, but perhaps some of the other roads we can think about in terms of motorways and also kind of rural setting, which obviously for Wales, we're talking about a lot of rural roads. So Mandy has asked, and I think her question might have been related to the review you did, but perhaps you can think about this more broadly. Did the review create issues for people walking on country lanes? Country lanes are highly problematic for active travel. So I think, what she means is how did you apply that to country lanes?
Yeah.
And then the question about motorways. Sorry, I'll just the other one.
Go on.
On most roads, goods vehicles have a lower limit than cars, e.g. HGV on motorways is 56 versus 70 miles an hour. Was any consideration given to a lower than 20 mile an hour limit for some vehicles or in some settings?
So on the first one, the view was that really the principal problem was in urban areas. Yes, of course, there are issues with country lanes, and so we know that. But the vast majority of casualties affecting pedestrians and cyclists are in urban areas where there are more people around. And the mechanism that was proposed would affect roads with street lighting. That was the simple change that we were able to make. So that would not of itself change the speed limit for country lanes. I mean, there has been some thought, not in this project, but of changing the law again, so that at the moment in England, or I think it's changed in Scotland now, but in England and Wales, the default speed limit for unlit roads is 60 miles an hour, which is ridiculous really for a country lane. In Scotland, I think it's changed to 50 now as the default. We did think about whether you could have a different default speed limit where there was no centre line, where the road was narrow enough to not have a centre line, but that would have been a more complicated law change. So yeah, I think the view was just bringing in default 20 was such a massive change. It was to be kept as simple as possible because the task was so vast. And the idea of using different speed limits for different classes of vehicles, I think we touched on that, but I just felt it was a complexity that we the benefits would not justify the complexity. It was going to be difficult enough to kind of get this through the system, so we kept it as simple as possible to make it applicable.
Great, we're really working you. I've got more questions. Has there been any change? I've got 3 questions. Has there been any change monitored to bus time reliability? A very good question. Scrolling up, these 2 questions about engagement. How, if at all, did you link in with community speed watch groups? I've always thought that was an obvious link, which isn't often made. And from Warren, in light of the controversy that surrounds projects like this, what are your thoughts on community engagement and framing techniques? Perhaps your sort of lessons learned on that. I mean, you've mentioned one about perhaps asking the question up front, so you feel like you've got a mandate. Thank you.
Okay, shall I start on bus time reliability and then I'll move on to Phil? So bus time reliability, yes, there's been quite a lot done in that space, and that was one of the things that was highlighted very much by the bus industry, and how this would delay the bus services, and in some instances it surely did add quite a bit to journeys, and there were some quite controversial places where in North Wales, in some villages, some buses decided to change their routes completely because of the 20 mile an hour. So it has been debated a lot, but there's also been, so for this new set of guidance, the local authorities, highway authorities were encouraged to look at bus journey data. So we tried to get that through various kind of channels for them to look at whether there had actually been, any significant increase, especially on those main strategic routes that the buses were doing. But in most cases, it seems that it hasn't necessarily had a big impact. But so it depends very much on where you look and what kind of route the buses are doing. So if it's a very just urban route, it will not really make a big difference. If it is an interurban route and it will have to go through a lot of settlements, yes, of course, it can have quite a big impact. But the bus industry was involved quite early on in the process. And many of them changed their timetables, according to that. And again, I think they are getting used to this new world as well. So yeah, but it's quite varied. Engagement just on the community speed watch, and then I'll let you respond to the last one, Phil. Yes, we have been, police and GoSafe have been working together with the community speed watch teams, and they have indeed, we have actually encouraged looking at trying to encourage more people to do it, and they were because the police did stop enforcing for a little bit of time once the new legislation had come into place, and actually the community speed watch teams were really, they wanted to get out there, so they've been very helpful in the process.
Thank you.
And,
Well, sorry, Phil.
To do the consultation very, very quickly. I mean, I think the lesson is it just takes an enormous effort, and I think again, the resources of the Welsh government, the resources of Welsh local government, for whatever reason, we're not sufficient. I think the rather kind of fond hope when we did the task force report was that local authorities would consult on what the future speed limit map looked like for each town, so that there would be detailed engagement. And I think for whatever reason, resources probably largely, they just didn't do that. There was not as much engagement, consultation. Sometimes they just only spoke to members, and I think it's a lot of it came as a big surprise to local people when it kind of came in a big rush. So I think the message for me is just not to skimp on the consultation. It is so important, but it's always hard, isn't it? It's always hard to find the resources to do that.
Thank you. Well, unfortunately, I think we're going to have to leave it there. I don't know if Adam or any of the other co-hosts in our team can figure out a way for Phil or Kaarina to join the Q&A so they can answer the questions kind of in text. I did want to, if Rod King is still with us, just give the floor to Rod to just kind of say anything that he wants to say. He's been such a amazing kind of force behind this whole 2020. And Rod, if you are there and you haven't kind of tuned out of for a moment, then I'd love to just see if there's anything you wanted to add.
Thanks. I'm very much tuned in. It's really encouraging to see so many of you here listening to the success story which there is in Wales. I often visit Wales, and it is remarkable how the pace on Welsh streets in villages and towns has changed, and it's remarkably different from how it was before the 17th of September 2023. One of the things which I would say has changed, which is so important for us all, is that if I go back about 7 years, maybe back to about 2015, you would find that most of the larger establishment, road safety, transportation consultancies were a little bit iffy on 20 mile an hour. There was very negative noises coming from the government on that after that ridiculous Atkins report in 2018, which didn't really consider any authority-wide 20 mile an hour limits, just a few legacy small 20 mile an hour limits. And I think there was a very much a feeling that the establishment was very much suppressing and certainly not encouraging 20 mile an hour as a default or as a norm for a town or council. But when we look today, the things are very different, right? We can see things like the Chartered Institution of Transport and Highways and Transportation saying in its latest report that the default speed limit should be a survivable speed limit for the road users, and they should accept upwards. So this change completely in the old model, which was have a relatively high speed limit, and then in some places we slow people down, it's turned into very much let's have a survivable default, and let's decide those special places where there's enough segregated facility, crossing facility, management of motor vehicles to enable them to go a little bit faster than that norm. And we've seen this from PAX, we've seen this from ROSPA, we've seen it from so many transportation authorities and businesses and companies which are saying, yes, 20 mile an hour should be the norm. So the mood music has completely changed. And I think that is so encouraging, if you like, when you see that we're on the cusp almost of 20 mile an hour being the foundation of everything which we want to do on active travel, everything which we want to do on a safe systems approach, everything which we want to do on Vision Zero. It's very clear that you'll never achieve those things with a default 30 mile an hour. So my message really is, look, Wales has done some great work. It's done, some bits of it weren't too good, right? I think we'll admit that, right? But the evidence is there. 28% reduction in casualties on 20-30 mile an hour roads. What that means is that beforehand, the casualties were actually 38% more than they are now. Looking back and saying, before we did this introduction, we were actually killing and maiming nearly 40% more on our roads, is a huge difference, which there is now. And that completely independent information coming out of the insurance companies, that actually the number of cars bumping into cars and damaging them themselves is 20% less than it was beforehand in Wales when the speed limit was 30 miles an hour. And that drives back into a benefit for drivers, as they say, the impact of that in reducing the premiums below what they would have been otherwise is £50 per car per annum. Now you take for the 40 million cars, which there are in the UK, and multiply 50 quid, right, by that, then you get an awful lot of money, which is actually fed back into the economy. And of course, you've got an awful lot of money, which is fed back into the economy because those cars aren't crashing into people and killing them as well. So
thank you so much, Rod.
So please, go forth and multiply the number of 20 mile an hour limits there are, because we're winning. Thank you.
Yeah, and if anyone doesn't follow Rod or 20's Plenty on any of their channels, a lot of that data is shared regularly and really great infographics and stuff like that. So we've really tried to pack it in today because we've got one more, thank you, Rod, we've got one more speaker, which is our regular, semi-regular Mark Philpott, who is going to talk about actually how what the benefits of going to 20 mile an hour, what it enables you to do to the public realm. And we've given him the impossible challenge of doing that in 10 minutes. So he's going to give it a go. And over to you, Mark.
I might be quicker. I'll probably mess up. I'll try and pack in. Let's go. So we've heard a lot about the benefits of 20 mile an hour speed limit. I'm going to speak a little bit about how we can use designs to maybe encourage, I say, force people to drive more slowly. So let's look at some stuff we can do quickly first. So I've been juggling, trying to do some drawings for a project, and listening to Phil and changing my slides on the fly here because I completely forgot that actually the Highways Traffic Calming Regulation of 1999, Section 8, Paragraph 2 actually now technically only applies to England because Wales don't have 21-hour zones. But there you go, in the middle there, that's a piece of legislation which basically is a nice get-out clause in England on what we can do within zones. Scotland has regulations which are more flexible, which talk about speed limits, and Wales obviously are now the same there. And what this means is that we can do things like not have to oversign absolutely everything. If we've got a 20-mile zone, we don't in England, we don't need all these road hump signs, lots of other signs can go. But actually traffic signs are locally determined anyway. So in England, Wales and Scotland, we can probably mess around and get rid of most of it. Because people are driving slow enough to see what's going on and they don't need warnings as they go ahead. Now, the other benefit is with this is we can also then deal with saving maintenance costs, electricity costs, stuff like that, if we get rid of some of these signs. So an example here is actually a lit pass to the right bollard in an area that is a 21-hour zone. So actually, why is that there in the first place? We could take that out, get rid of that maintenance liability, get rid of that power liability. It costs you to disconnect things from the power grid. That's fine. That is a one-off cost. But then from thereafter, you're not going to have to pay for power. So if you're going through to do a scheme, let's declutter as we go along and deliver that saving and a nice looking street. We also have traffic signs regulations, the general directions I've talked about a lot here before. If we're within a 20-mile limit, again, this really goes in hard on what you don't need to light. So let's give you a practical example, which is better. Top and bottom here, couple of streets, both filtered, both very, very quiet, but the top one is still 30 miles an hour, and so the no motor vehicle sign at the top has to be lit. Again, yeah, waste of power, waste of having to maintain the little lanterns at the top. At the bottom, it's within a big 20 area anyway. That's a default limit now, essentially, in central London. So you don't need to light the thing. So that's stuff we can do now as we go along. We can, if we're a bit worried about in England the definition between a limit and a zone, we can do a risk assessment, and I would say most of the time we just take all this stuff out. So stuff that takes a bit longer. Let's go to Manual for Streets, which is from 2007, exclamation mark, because people don't use it enough. Now, it's not kind of saying you should do this, but it's kind of saying this is what fits down traffic lanes or street widths, carriageway widths. So if we're going down to 20, that gives us an awful lot of license to squeeze that space right the way down, which will really encourage people to go slower, especially drivers that don't like to be driving towards each other at any great speed. So again, not saying you have to do this, but let's probably tend towards these narrow widths, depending on the traffic makeup. So if there's lots of HGVs and buses, we would tend to go a touch wider. Bus operators massively resist narrow lanes, but you know, there's lots of places they take buses where there's parking and it's happening by default. But let's try and squeeze that and have that conversation with the bus operators. So let's look at some other things then, round off. Tackle those turnings. Absolutely horrific side road here. Both of these roads aren't particularly busy whatsoever. The one on the right certainly isn't. So this layout is not encouraging drivers to slow down either coming into or going out of the junction. So let's tackle this by really squeezing down here. So again, we're in 20, we're in Camden here in London. Let's use continuous footways. Let's make these junctions really, really hard to turn into, and let you actually slow right the way down. Gives designers lots and lots of license to really push the envelope here. Let's take the space back. So here is Blackfriars Road, just outside TfL's building, which is on the left outer shot. It's not a really old bus showing the age of the photo that happened to be there, but this is quite an old photo from, I don't know, 10 years ago maybe. 3 traffic lanes approaching the junction, massive vast junction. But in the distance there, Blackfriars Road, 1 lane in each direction, crazy wide, nothing to slow people down. Kind of mad there. So here's Blackfriars Road, there's left, taking the shot from the other direction. And out of all that space, we've actually carved out a nice big 2-way cycle track and wider footways. And we've done that by squeezing the traffic width down. And again, squeeze that width down, slow the drivers down, things are a lot calmer. when this was first built, it was still quite a busy road. There's still lots of buses on there, so protection of people walking and cycling is still sensible. Let's take some liberties. So again, we've squeezed the base down. Let's start shoving stuff into the road. High bike parking, maybe. We've got some bollards here. We don't quite have drivers not back into them or drive into them. But, you know, let's take that liberty and repurpose that curb space. Now the area has got no limit. Here's another one. Again, this is actually within a 21-hour zone. This used to be parking bays next to the school, repurposed rain gardens. I still don't think you need that traffic sign there at all. You know, if you can't see trees and curbs and things, you're probably driving too fast. So let's really put the boat out with that license taking. Quite an old one from Cambridge. This is the whole area, which is 20 again, but contraflow cycling, and 20 go together very, very well, where you have to have one-way streets for motor traffic access, but let's squeeze that down again in space and in speed. And here we are in Wales. I think this is my last slide. 20 area, this is Tap Embankment in Cardiff. I can't go into all the details that make this a cycle street, almost a cycle street. But the foundation of having the 20, I guess it was a 20 zone when it was built. It is now a 20 limit, as we've heard from our colleagues. So let's push the boats out again, squeeze the space of traffic, get the cycle flows up on the main cycle routes. But 20 gives us a lot of license to do that. Oh no, another liberty to take. Yeah, this is just another good example of repurposing that space, but look how narrow those traffic lanes are. Those are down to 3 meters, no problem at all with that. Cambridge, even 30 miles an hour down to 3 meter lanes on some of the routes going into the city. At 20, plenty of license to just keep squeezing that space. And that was the last slide. Thank you very much. And it was within 10 minutes. There you go.
Wow, I gave you what I thought was an impossible task, and you've done well there, Mark. And I think just showing kind of the benefits, as we said in the discussion, the benefits of 20 mile an hour in terms of being, there's obviously the reduction in casualties, but what you've done there is shown the kind of different design choices that can be made. We've got 2 minutes. If anyone has one question, I will invite anyone to ask it. Otherwise, I'm just going to start wrapping up. So if I see a hand in the chat go up, I'll ask it. Otherwise, it just remains for me to say thank you to our guest speakers, Phil and Kaarina. Thank you for answering all those brilliant questions, and thank you for asking those brilliant questions. And we watch with interest how this progresses. Thank you to Mark for that really insightful follow-up talk. And just remains for me to say that next week we've got another really great speaker in Christian Wolmar, the railway journalist and author, going to be talking about kind of the opportunities under Labour, under this new government, and you know what their kind of rail commitments might lead to, and the challenges that we might see under that as well. So, thank you to Phil. Thank you, Kaarina. Thank you, Mark, and see you next time.
Great.